The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hey, Jennifer.
Hi, Monica.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of Biophilic Solutions. Before we dive in, I think maybe we should talk about this word, biophilia. It's kind of a mouthful, and most people have never heard of it. What do you think, Jennifer?
Totally. It's not the most beautiful word, but the idea behind it is super beautiful. I mean, basically, biophilia refers to this very human desire to connect with nature, and so much of that connection has been lost in modern times. It's so good for our mental and physical health to connect with nature and feel like we are part of nature, and that simple idea is at the forefront of new thinking about design, urban planning, mental health, and the conversation around climate change and protecting the earth.
So biophilia is a simple idea, but maybe also super broad?
Totally. And our conversation today is about biophilic communities and what that looks like and how we can advocate for biophilic land planning in our own communities.
Especially thinking about our experiences with COVID and the possibility of future pandemics, we need more communities that are resilient and forward thinking. It's more important than ever.
Absolutely. And to your point, today we're talking to Dr. Phill Tabb, a land planner, architect, and scholar who has been at the forefront of the biophilic movement for nearly 20 years. Dr. Tabb is Professor Emeritus of Architecture at Texas A&M and is the author of multiple publications on topics such as solar energy, green architecture, and sustainable urban design.
His most recent work is the book Biophilic Urbanism, which we're going to dive into today. He talks about nature-based urban environments that are climate positive, sustainable, and healthy. Dr. Tabb is also the lead land planner for the biophilic community of Serenbe, which is located just outside of Atlanta, where, spoiler alert, Phil and I both live.
So without further ado, let's get into our interview with Dr. Phill Tabb.
Welcome, Phil.
So do I talk now?
Yeah, how are you? Welcome. Thanks for being on the podcast. You're our inaugural episode.
All right. Well, to start off, for me, biophilia is a set of relationships between nature, human beings, and the environment. And each of those interact with one another. In other words, the environment has an impact on nature, as does nature have an impact on the environment. And nature has an impact on humans, as do humans have an impact on nature. And finally, humans have an impact on the environment as the environment has an impact on humans. So there's these 6 components that comprise, in a way, the function of biophilia.
Okay, I'm going to have to get a chart for that and figure that whole thing out. But it sounds like it's basically we are all affecting each other, and we have to be really thoughtful and aware of those interconnections.
Yes.
Tell me about biophilia a little bit. Like, when did you stumble across it? Has this been something in your work forever, or is this something new to you?
Yes and no. I grew up in southeast Idaho, which is one of the more beautiful places in America. And I thought that everywhere was full of nature. You know, we were right next to the Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone National Park, the Tetons, and so on. And so I've always had a close connection to nature. But specifically with biophilia, I think my first interaction with the term was with a guy by the name of Plenty Fisk, who is a sustainable planner and landscape architect from Austin, Texas. And he went to the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s when Louis Kahn and Ian McHarg were teaching there. And Ian McHarg wrote the book Design with Nature in 1970. I got his book back then. This is the actual book.
Wow.
So mean, back in early 1970s, designed with nature. I mean,
Right.
there it is, right? And he's not really credited too much with biophilia, but I think his concept certainly is a component of biophilia.
And did he talk about cities and bringing nature into cities, or was he just talking about it in general?
He was talking more, I think, in general, but as a concept that affects, all scales of design.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a center outside of Austin, Texas, and he primarily started by focusing on sustainability, but then expanded into all of the elements of water collection and solar and so on, and then moved into biophilia. I was a department head in 2004, and I hired him at Texas A&M. So that's why I got to know planning quite well. And then, of course, working with Serenbe and the early stages of the Biophilic Institute, I had groups of students here from Texas A&M that were living as a part of a study away program. And we actually looked at biophilia, among other things, here at Serenbe. So that was another sort of one of my introductions to biophilia. And of course, being on the board of the Biophilic Institute here at Serenbe has allowed me to interact with a lot of really world-renowned people in the field.
What year did you move to Serenbe, Phill?
Well, I built my house in 15 and 16, and then I moved here in the summer or the late spring of 2017.
Mm-hmm. When you did move to Serenbe, did it kind of change your vision of how you saw biophilic design or how you want to intend it to look for yourself?
No, I had already ideas about that because I started planning Serenbe in 2001.
Yeah,
and this was before biophilia really was a very common term. Although Olson's book in 84, I believe, and Tillert's book came out in the 80s. Kaplan and Kaplan came out in 89. These are all books that were early academic writings on biophilia by non-designers, but oriented towards designers. And it wasn't until, I would say, 2010-ish and on did it really begin to infiltrate the design world.
Interesting.
Terrapin Bright Green's 14 patterns had a huge influence, even though it was not a book. It was an online PDF that got circulated quite a bit. And it was one of the first, examples of, design guides of what to do. And really nothing had come out since then. I think it was 2014 when that book came out. That was 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's not very long ago.
Yeah.
Phill, are people, is it being taught at universities and colleges? Is biophilia being taught like as a true class or sort of industry?
I don't really see it as an industry. I see it as a focus field. It's not taught, to my knowledge, as a full course, Biophilia 101, but it is taught within other courses. I know at Texas A&M, we have an environment and behavior class that brings up biophilia as a component of that. And the sustainability course that I taught at Texas A&M also brought up biophilia as a component of sustainability.
Interesting.
Do you think it would be taught, though, in the future?
Could be.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I got more seriously involved in biophilia is what I was always looking for umbrellas that are bigger than the smaller umbrellas. So always looking for the big one. And, of course, in my world, I started off with solar energy, and then it went to renewable energy, and then it went to sustainability, and then finally, I think, biophilia. And the thing I like about biophilia is that it encompasses a lot of other tangential areas, such as placemaking, the spiritual component to the environment, health and wellness, of course, and I think climate neutrality. So in my book, I point out those, 5 outcomes, which makes the book a little bit unique to what's been written before, because most of the previous books focus on health and wellness as a major outcome of biophilia. My book, I really felt that mitigating climate change, creating more sustainable environments, creating placemaking, especially from the social point of view, and health and wellness, of course. And then finally, the numinous, which is our emotional and spiritual relationship to the unknown, or to spirit. So all of those seem to be components that were important.
Talk about, biophilic cities or biophilic urbanism. You've talked about sort of what biophilia is, but like, what is a biophilic urban space look like?
Yeah.
Good question.
I mean, that's a good question. And even though as an architect, I'm very visual, it's not how it looks to me that's important. It's how it functions.
Okay.
On all these different levels, like the 5 outcomes. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at any scale, at what scale can you begin to deal with climate neutrality? Mm-hmm. Scale, and in fact, you can find out that on all those scales, you can deal with all those outcomes. Mm-hmm. But they're a little bit different. The scale has a way of creating a difference. For example, at the community and urban scale, design elements such as infrastructure become more important than, let's say, the biophilia of a single room in a house. Mm. So as you move up scale, you begin to get into bigger, more systemic ways of dealing with biophilia. Mm-hmm. In terms of resilience, I think for me, the most basic component of resilience is the idea of survival advantage. Mm. When biophilia first came into, at least this is what a lot of the early academics on biophilia began to say, is that during the savanna hypothesis period, which was about 1.8 million years ago, when we became bipedal, that along with that became a certain kind of self-awareness and consciousness that led to this notion of biophilia, the love of nature. Hmm. And in addition to that, we began to evolve from, let's say, the forested areas, which were affected by climate change and what they call the arid hypothesis, into the savannas. And so what makes us resilient is our ability to find survival advantages in certain settings. Mm-hmm. And fast forward to today.
Sure.
And look at COVID, for example. Where is it safe to be, to exist in a COVID-laden environment? And that's part of our survival advantage, is finding those places. Mm-hmm. And of course, I think Serenbe is a community that echoes that.
Sure. And I personally, of course, love that you say that. But my first thought is like, what is safe is the outside, right? Mm-hmm. We're hearing so much like, if you're outside, it's safer. They still require masks, still 6 feet. But like, have your gathering outside, or if you're going to get together with people, get together outside. I think so many places, Jennifer's in New York, and obviously I'm down here in sort of the country. Phil and I are in the country and outside of Atlanta. It's easier to get outside in different places. But talk about, cities, that's where the majority of people live, and or individuals in the suburbs that just don't have access to a trailhead or a park. What are the opportunities to change that? Like, who's doing the work, or how do we change that placemaking in our environment?
It's a really difficult question because, the past political environments have been such that you can't do anything, let alone change for biophilia. Mm-hmm. So we have a huge inventory of existing buildings and cities and streets and so on, and the technologies that support those. Uh-huh. And to begin to change all of them worldwide is unbelievable. We're talking about centuries of work. Right. And of course, most of us live in the present. So what is it I can do today?
Yeah.
And if you're an individual, there are a lot of things that you can do in the home. Uh-huh. And you can also begin to support your community making some changes. And to some degree, through political processes generally, you can affect what can happen in cities. But one thing that seems to be happening is the migration.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there is a migration because of COVID out of cities. Mm-hmm. And that leads me to think that, and because of the way the work situation has worked for many people, my son and daughter-in-law have been working at home for 9 months, mm-hmm. and will do so for another 9 months. Mm-hmm. So it's not new, but not all jobs allow that. Mm-hmm. But that's beginning to change the work landscape. Mm-hmm. And also because that work landscape is beginning to change, it's beginning to change the necessity for really highly dense cities. Mm-hmm. A professor of mine at Washington State University used to ask his students, this was a structural professor, what was the single most important technology that allowed for the evolution of the high-rise building.
Oh, interesting. What was that?
Well, a lot of people said, well, was it heating and air conditioning systems? Was it the elevator?
Uh-huh.
Was it curtain wall skins that go onto high-rise buildings?
Sure.
Anyway, his hit was the single most important technology was the telephone.
What? You're kidding me.
Because it allowed people to be able to work way up in the air and connect to everybody else.
Wow.
So I think in this day and age, especially with the internet and Zoom and so on, you can see how important that is. And of course, to do Zooming and telephoning and texting you do not need to be in a high-rise building to do that.
Oh.
I know that feeling now that I'm like you said, I live in New York City, but right now I'm recording this up in the Catskills. And when you were saying that the plight of people leaving and just everyone taking off from cities, everyone up here, the homes they're gone because everyone moved from New York to live here in the Catskills area. And it's a beautiful place to reside. But I understand it's just that mentality. Everyone's like, I got to get out. I need to breathe. I need more space. I need some solace in the woods. But I can definitely feel that for sure.
Now, the flip side of the argument is, well, what do we do with cities?
Mm-hmm.
I think, 100 years ago when we had pandemics, and even before that, city planning was highly influenced by diseases. And that's where parks and tree-lined streets come in. And those are things that can happen. Even pedestrianization can happen. And those particular moves have been seen to be very beneficial and to actually reverse the migration tendencies back into city centers. Monteverde in Spain is a good example. In 2000, but actually 1999, they decided to get rid of the car in the historic area of the city. Mm-hmm. And since that time, population has increased. There's more a percentage of families with children. There's only been 1 or 2 automobile deaths within the last 20 years. Wow. Of course, CO2 levels have really gone down and so on. So, that's something that I'm beginning to see is happening more and more throughout the world, getting rid of the automobile in downtown.
Yeah, and you're seeing that in, San Francisco, London, obviously New York with either Times Square or Herald Square. And even in Atlanta, I think the Beltline is an interesting example. High Line in New York would be another example. But, we moved to Atlanta, 20 years ago, no Beltline, it was just an idea in Ryan Gravel's head. And, I didn't feel like Atlanta was a very outdoorsy place, but they built something that got people outdoors. It drove them to this belt line that then, had tons of infrastructure, apartments, restaurants, and everything along it and connected all these neighborhoods. And now, Piedmont Park, which is the central park in the middle of the city, which is connected to the belt line. You can barely get on the belt. You can barely walk the belt line. It's so busy. And so there is a bit of the, if we build it or, we don't even know what we need. And I think biophilia is a big thing to me, at least, is like, we don't, when I first heard it, I was like, I don't know what that is. But now that I understand it, it's just like, it seems like it's everything.
Yes.
So how do you feel like, your book just came out, obviously you've been working in the industry for a while or the field, but what's your thought about scaling it and how this book will help, or what do people need to do? Obviously we can do things individually, but I'm a big advocate that we need to, push the people who really have the power to make changes. What can we do, and what are you seeing about scalability?
Well, scalability is ultimately what we need to have happen. And not only, Tim Bately's books on biophilic cities talks about, I think, 5 different scales: room, architecture, street, block, community, and region. Ultimately, it's going to have to be the whole planet, right? And that's going to be a huge challenge, I think, to get to that scale. If you take the 5 outcomes, and maybe there are more outcomes than those 5, climate neutrality, sustainability, placemaking, health and wellness, and the numinous.
By the way, just a reminder to everyone listening, numinous refers to the spiritual aspect of biophilic design. It's one of the positive outcomes.
if you take those and begin to scale them, you'll see that they scale in slightly different ways. And sometimes there's actual contradictions when you start to scale them. For example, density is a good sustainable strategy. It creates more efficiency. But density also begins to create difficulties for solar access. So low density is better for solar access, high density is better for efficiency.
Okay.
So you have these contradictions. And as you move up and down the scale, you're going to find out that you have similar contradictions. But you're going to have more similarities. For example, you can have a plant in your room. You can plant trees in your garden. You can plant trees along the street. You can create a pocket park in your neighborhood. You can create a large park and tree-lined streets and edible plants in your community. And within your region, you can begin to plan around ecological flows. So these are all things that we can begin to do as you begin to up the scale. And it is really important to think in a scalar way, I think, because it's more comprehensive.
Right.
Sure.
It's one thing to put a plant in your room, and that's good, right? But you're not going to solve all the problems of the world by putting the plant there.
So true. Actually, can you speak to that? Because I know you talked about the home. So what if people are just trying to understand, what does biophilia mean to my home? And what can I do in my own home to be more biophilic or be better planners for, even to teach our own children? How do we think about that first?
Well, if you look at the biophilic patterns, and Stephen Killert had 72 patterns, and then later he and Liz Calabrese reduced that down to 25. Phillip and Bright Green had initially 14 patterns, and they've added awe as the 15th.
Love that.
In my book on serene urbanism, I had 20 placemaking patterns. And in this new book on biophilic urbanism, I have 25 patterns. And there's a lot of crossover on these patterns. So, for example, if you were to look at the 25 patterns and go through that list and say, okay, what can I do in my own home relative to those patterns? Then you can begin to answer the question. For example, the second pattern is our relationship to the animal kingdom. So get a bird or a cat, or a dog. Or if you're fortunate enough to live in a place like Serenbe, we have 123 different bird species here. So wake up in the morning and go out and listen to the birds. I mean, that is a biophilic function. That's just the second one. And of course, there's a relationship to nature, to the plant kingdom, which having the potted plant in your room would do. Sensual experiences, opening up all the senses is going to create, let's say, greater healing, potential for greater healing. And of course, walking around Serenbe and places like Serenbe, if you walk by the daisy, you can smell the food being prepared. You can hear sounds of bells ringing and so on. So all the senses get activated. So I think that's an important one. Of course, prospect and refuge is another one. And that's an interesting one that exists on both the house scale and community scale. The omega shapes in Serenbe are ideal prospect and refuge planning shapes, because you have the prospector looking into the omega centers and you have the surveillance of streets. And at the same time, the omega shape creates a protected inner area, just as, let's say, the living room in your house creates a protected area. So those are two ways in which prospect and refuge are expressed at these different scales.
Yeah, and I remember learning about that concept from Bill Browning, and the example, and tell me if this is correct, I always think of why does everybody want the corner booth in a restaurant?
Exactly.
And that corner booth in the restaurant provides both prospect and refuge, right? You're protected, you're sort of in the back, your back is protected, and then you can see out. And that is this really deep-seated biological.
And it's so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's an inherited, what Killert would say is an inherited genetic quality of our evolutionary biology. So yes, that is true. So that's an important one. And if you go down the list, take a look at Killert's 72 items. The reason there's so many, he has about 5 or 6 items dealing with natural light or with light. And what Phill Browning and I have done is kind of collapse those 5 or 6 elements all into one, which I call all aspects of light.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, according to Killert's listing, things like light and shadow. And of course, we get that here in Ceramon when you walk out in the woods, especially this time of year when you get the shadows of the trees, especially early in the morning and later at night. You get these beautiful long shadows crossing the paths. You get diffuse light like we've had when it's not so sunny here. You get direct light coming in. You have sort of flickering light. If you're out in the woods and you see the leaves beginning to move, and then that affects and gives it a more dynamic quality of light. And you have, let's say, night light. And here at Ceramon, of course, we protect the night skylight, but at the same time, the night light is mandated to be very low and very subtle and down pointed.
Exactly. We don't really have like master huge street lights that we encourage everybody to have. I think it's actually required, a light on your house. And that front door light is supposed to be solar activated, and that's supposed to sort of illuminate the street in a very subtle way, which I think is an interesting design element versus these sort of like encroaching poles that sort of turn it to day. Yeah, like New York.
Yeah.
In my house, I have, and I can't say that this is something that everybody can do or design, but I have what's called a light gradient that goes from my living room, which is really bright light, to my office, which is medium, to my bedroom, which is darker.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And you did that through architecture.
Yes. And the idea is having variable light qualities within your house instead of having the same light quality everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it begins to have you focus your eyes in different ways. I mean, these are just really subtle things that for me, is more than just putting a plant in the corner of your room.
Sure.
Let's see, color, which is another one of my patterns, which I don't think Killert or even Terrapin have used, which I call living color. And I got living color really from Feng Shui. And it's the idea of being able to experience real alive color, artificial color. And artificial color in itself is not bad. But experiencing the red of a real red rose is different than experiencing the red on a wall. So it has a much different kind of vibrance to it, aliveness to it. So that's why we call it living color. So
I've never heard of that. That's so interesting.
So the more living color you can have in your room, for example, then again, you're exposing yourself to another quality of biophilic design.
That's interesting. You think about people buying fresh flowers or, why is that such a wonderful experience, beyond a permanent plant? But that's interesting to think it's not just, that it cleans the air or it's a natural product in the house, but the living color. I've never really thought about that. And, we love a brand of paint called Farrow and Ball, which, is fabulous. And it's so beautiful on the wall. And my understanding is it's like it has so many more pigments in it. And it sort of changes with the light a little bit. And I think more and more companies have done that over the years. But I had never thought about, maybe why I'm attracted to or why all of us are attracted to natural living things. That's another reason.
Yes. Now, another one of the patterns is our connection to the celestial world. And again, this is a design thing. In my house, it was important that I had visual access to the night sky. And, when it's about a quarter moon to a half moon, I can look right out my living room windows and I can see it up there at about 9 o'clock.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
Okay. Now, what good is that? Well,
I like it. I love looking for the moon in New York City, which is hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty.
Yeah,
it is, but it expands your world.
Sure,
it expands it to something larger than your house, your community, to the world around us, and knowing our place in this larger world, I think, is really healthy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that touches on awe. Can you talk about awe a little bit? Because I think that sits in, does that sit in the numinous? Okay. Talk a little bit about that. Because that's, I think, a concept that we're going to hear more and more about in the coming, months and years.
I think so. In fact, I have a new book proposal out called Thin Places, The Hidden Function of Architecture and Urban Design.
Oh.
So it really focuses in on the experience of awe, which, using the concept of thin places, is the threshold for that experience.
Give us an example. Like, what would be a thin place?
Well, it can exist on any scale. Let's say Piazza San Marco. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you've ever been there, or the first time you went in there, you were probably kind of blown away, right?
Yeah.
And that's an experience of awe. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon?
Yep. Or Yosemite.
Yeah, or along a beautiful beach. These are all natural or an intimate, let's say, natural setting, like a beautiful little clearing in the woods, or here at Serenby, the waterfalls. These are all natural thin places. Now, in architecture, it can happen as well. There's a lot of really extraordinary buildings, from the MIT Chapel done by Louis I. Kahn to a place that I've discovered. It's a little glass chapel in Mexico. It's really beautiful. And you can also find them in everyday. That's another part of this book proposal is kind of the numinous or thin places in everyday.
Love that.
Window seats.
Oh.
When the light pours in and you're reading a book or you're just hanging out in this teeny little place, and it becomes a thin place. And a thin place is defined as a place, since it's a space, it's a place where there's a veil, a very thin veil between the secular and the sacred.
Oh.
When it's a thin place, it gets thinner and thinner to the point where in many ways it goes away. And you have this numinous experience with God or nature or whatever it is that is unexplainable. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I think this realm, the realm of awe, is really going to be of interest. And it too has many interesting outcomes, of which health and wellness is one of them.
Absolutely.
And I think it has a collateral kind of positive outcome towards sustainability, placemaking, and some of these other outcomes. Because if you're in a thin place, you're going to want to sustain this kind of place. So whenever you come to it, you have that same experience. The Western Wall in Jerusalem is a thin place. Okay. The stone in Mecca is a thin place. There's so many examples of thin places. But the ones that I think are really, and the book is kind of oriented this way, is to show what a thin place is, but also to bring it down to your everyday experience, much like what biophilia is trying to do as well.
And that kind of leads us to case studies in your book.
Yeah. Well, in the book, there are 6 what I call precedents and 1 case study. The case study is Serenby, and it goes into a lot of detail. I'll talk a little bit about that after I talk about the precedents. And the precedents evolve in the book from smaller scale to a larger scale. Okay. So in a way, the precedents are scaling. So the first precedent is a place that I visited many times called Castillo de Garganza in Tuscany. And it's a 13th century medieval town that was originally designed as one horseback ride away from Siena. Wow. It overlooks the Val di Chiana, which is the main valley that connects Tuscany back to Rome.
Yes.
And it was an outpost so that the Sienese could tell if either Arezzo or Rome was marching on them. So they were one horseback ride away. But it was a little sustainable community, tiny, with originally about 30 homes in it. It has a little parish church and a square and a tower, and it's got a battered wall around it. And it's really a beautiful little place now that was sort of run down about, 20 years ago. And then it was purchased by a count from Florence, and then he has repurposed it into kind of a conference center. And there are 23 of these beautiful little cottages that you can stay in. And like I said, it's got this parish church and a well. And it's got really beautifully updated conference facilities. And so they're getting a lot of sort of corporate management people coming out and having these conferences there. And every year that I was in Castiglione Fiorentino, I would take my class there and we would spend the day there and have lunch there. So that's one of the precedents. And of course, it has what's strong there is the fact that it's similar to Serenbe in that it's in the middle of woods. Mm-hmm. And two, it has this wonderful prospect, in that case, of the Val di Chiana. And it has gardens and trees within it, and it's bounded really beautifully, and bounding is another one of the patterns. And it has a true center, which is this plaza and a well in the center. So, and it has natural materiality, beautiful stonework and wood in it. And like I said, it has gardens. And there's a lot of sort of wild animals that are around the area, so people staying there can interact with them. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's the first one. The next one is a little odd, which I think but it's really interesting, is the Google headquarters in Mountain View.
So different.
Yes.
So different. And what I really liked about Google was, among other high-tech businesses, it is really transforming the business landscape, the employee landscape. And both my son and daughter-in-law work for Google, so I've had the opportunity to visit Mountain View, their facility in Boulder, and their facility in Zurich. It always blows me away with the kind of personal freedom and the encouragement of creativity, and also the encouragement of interaction and health and wellness that goes on in these businesses. It's just quite extraordinary. So also the firm BIG is designing a new addition. It's actually a new facility in the Mountain View, and it's a big, huge dome-like space that's going to have plants and this very creative work landscape inside. It also has a way where the existing community of Mountain View can actually begin to interact with the building in a greater way. Interesting. Most of the times, like if you think of I shouldn't be saying this, but if you think of the Apple building, which is this huge donut building, and it's like, don't come into me, it's really repelling in a way, where I think the Google is really trying to create a more, what we call a front door experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, many of the tech companies, having friends in San Francisco, the ones that are in downtown San Francisco, and we won't name them, you can imagine, they came in and they said they got all of these concessions through the city because they were going to bring all of these people, but they ended up creating their own internal ecosystem with their own dry cleaners and food. And actually, the workers didn't actually leave the building and actually support the local community. And it became this very insular, it sort of purported to be something that was going to transform a neighborhood, but it ended up being very insular. So I love to see that Google is moving to create campuses that are more inclusive rather than exclusive, because that's a huge thing that I think we talk about a lot in placemaking is like, there's no gates, like so many of these neighborhoods are gated and you're kind of like created this little jail that you're trapped in, and only you can come in, and there's just no energy, because a real town, a real space, has people flowing in and out, and that openness is really beautiful, and what we should all be looking towards. And I think is, potentially one thing that makes a biophilic city or a resilient city is that, would permeability be the right word? I don't know quite what the right word is, but
porousness.
Porousness.
Okay. That makes sense. It's the way you really feel in a space. It's that kind of ebb and flow of a space that it gives to you, that you recognize it, I think, right away, how good you feel somewhere. And it's almost palpable, I think.
Well, one of the things that was a hidden agenda for me was the idea of matching Serenbe with Google.
Talk about that.
The idea of marrying a Google kind of place and Serenbe is to attack one of the biggest polluters that we have, which is the commute to work, residential communities to work. And you talk about resilience, and it is the resilience to be able to transform the kinds of cities that we've created in the 19th and 20th centuries versus the ones that are going to evolve in this 21st century.
And let me follow up on that. What changes are we most likely to see in cities to support that outcome in the next, I'll call it 20 to 50 years?
I think it's what is now being called landform and landscape urbanism. So it's more about horizontal territoriality than it is vertical. Now, of course, if you live in Manila or Tokyo or Shanghai or New York City, places like this, they're very vertical cities. And I just don't see, remember why do we have high rises? You know, what's the major technology that's allowing for high rises? It's basically communication. And with today's communication, we don't need that same kind of concentration. And it's going to have negative environmental effects to be horizontal, because one of the advantages of vertical cities is they take up less land. So in a way, I still think from a biophilic point of view, going more horizontal is going to be the trend. Personally, and this is my own personal view, if I never have to use an elevator again the rest of my life, I'll be happy.
Yes, and I will second those awful parking lots where you're driving in circles and circles and circles and circles to get to your space, and then you have to get into an elevator. Ugh.
Yeah. Well, the next precedent to kind of push on is after Google is a place called I got to get the right pronunciation. It's Helsing-Havby. It's a Danish name. And it's a small community about an hour north of Copenhagen. And it's an existing town, but this community is right on the edge of town. And it's within walking distance of right downtown where there's lots of restaurants and so on. And it's maybe about the same scale of Serenbe, but it has about 2,500, I think, population. And it's a series of 25 clusters. They're like donut shapes of single family and attached housing that are surrounded by farms. So it's an agri-hood there, and they have some mixed use, and they have a thing that's called the food hub, which is like a center within all these little centers, where the community can meet, and they can have community dinners and so on like that. But each residence has their own way of doing this. It's somewhat like co-housing, but not quite so strict as co-housing, which also started in Denmark. Anyway, that's the second or third. The fourth one is, I believe, Kronsberg, which is, it's called the Kronsberg District. It's in Hanover, Germany. And I had the opportunity to go there in the year 2000 when it opened. And it was designed to be one of the most sustainable communities. It also has agriculture. It's a little bit denser than some of these other communities I've been talking about. And one of the things I featured in my book that it has is what are called super blocks. And they're large blocks that are porous, meaning that you can go into them. And inside is, a couple of acre site, 2 to 3 or 4 acre sites that are natural.
Wow.
And each block has a different kind of nature inside.
Oh, wow.
Some have daycare, some have elementary schools, some have parks, some have water retention, some have streams going through them. And they're all interconnected in a pedestrian kind of network. And so that was one of the main features that I thought was biophilic. It also had, as you can imagine, a square donut having great prospect and refuge, right?
Sure.
And access to nature. It also has a density gradient going from a tram on one end, a tram line on one end, to the farms on the other end. And so the density is about 5 stories on the tram end, going down to 2 stories on the farm end. So I thought it was, and then the streets, really interesting. They're tree-lined streets. But depending on what side of the basic district you're in and which orientation, east, west, and north, south, have different kinds of trees.
Wow.
So that and they're made with fruit trees. So whether you're going east and west or north and south, depending on what kind of trees are there.
Oh, that's a wonderful signal.
Yeah. So there's a lot of small little details like that. And then the overall large one, like these super blocks, I think are wonderful. So that is Kronsberg. And then the next one is Monteverde, Spain, which I've talked about already, that is a remarkable place. And there's more places like that happening. It just happens to be one that I was not that familiar with. And I started doing the research on it, and I found it just really fascinating. And the fact that it started about the same time Serenbe did. Serenbe started in 2000, basically, and Monteverde started in 1999. Mm. So it's amazing what can happen in 20 years. I mean, a lot of really wonderful radical change can happen.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting because, your books are, tend to be more academic, I want to say, but this one it's very dense, but I think it actually could be like a really wonderful sort of, pseudo coffee table book because the concepts are so phenomenal. And the hope is that, we get like, government, city planners or city council or mayors or governors that are sort of exposed to these ideas that they can transform their cities, but also the everyday person like ourselves that can sort of, if you will, demand these changes or advocate for these changes in our cities, because we do have power,
Yeah.
On the last question I'd like to ask you is really, what is the importance of biophilia in your life? And not necessarily like in a work perspective, but maybe how it makes you feel, your overall health.
Great. And in fact, it's kind of been a lifesaver. 2 years ago, I came down with 2 forms of cancer and have more or less kicked both of them. One of them was cut out. It's long gone. And the other one is just through lifestyle changes. Part of it's because I'm retired, but I work just as hard as I did before. But the main reason is stress reduction, I think, and the quality of social interaction that I can monitor living in Serenbe with my tendency to be reclusive. So, and then, of course, my interaction with nature. I can't, right now I'm looking out, I can see a huge view of trees in my garden. And I think these all have contributed to just a sense of accomplishment of, that my life has led to this point. Mm-hmm. I have this kind of environment to live in, both in terms of being able to live in Serenbe and to live in my house and to interact with both the people and nature that's around here. Every day I open up my windows, even on a day like today, and let in fresh air. It's found out that indoor air pollution is a major cause of colds. Not cold outside. So, beginning to get a little bit of air changing is really great. I love the idea that most of my electricity comes from photovoltaic panels on my roof. And I have very little pollution here. But I think that, the visual environment, all the patterns are here. I've got a little dog, and I have an incredible number of animals that come into my garden, from snakes to birds to frogs, you name it. And all these things in little ways, I think, contribute to a biophilic experience. And the one on awe, I think, is also, there are a lot of times, well, when you get into it really deeply, in a way, that which is sacred chooses, you don't. It's like you walk into the woods, I'm going to have a sacred experience, right? It's not a human-centered process. In a way, it's a divine-centered process. And so the best that we can do is be open to it. And if you're open to it, then you're creating an opportunity for those kinds of experiences to occur. Another thing that's very interesting about awe that's been done by some researchers, William James wrote about this, that awe experiences, or what he calls numinous experiences, are momentary. They last between 10 or 15 minutes to up to an hour or two max. And go away. And another quality of them is that they do create this kind of transcendent change, almost like a metabolic change in society. So these are important, I think, to have these experiences. I can remember when I was younger and I had kids and family and work and problems and issues and credit card debt, and you name it. And it's just like, I can remember in my mid-30s to late 30s, what it was all about was trying to find 10 minutes to a half hour a day where I could just be myself and be alone. And by the time you get to my age now, it's not that. It's like 99% of my time is like that. And of course, to me, it's all biophilic.
That's great. Well, Phill, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm super excited about the new book. You've put so many wonderful ideas into our heads.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's a gift to have you, Phill. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be first on this podcast.
Our pleasure.
Okay. Well, you guys take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh, wow. So that interview was so great. Where do we even begin?
I know. So many things that I could have talked about for hours. I mean, hours and hours.
Seriously, thin places, that whole idea blew my mind.
Okay, let's wrap it up as best as we can.
So what I heard was a biophilic community is a place where people have access to nature and can easily engage with the outdoors. He also talked about planning and development should be prioritizing the natural resources and ecological conditions of each area that you're doing that building and planning in.
Right, and there are 5 outcomes of that kind of planning. Think of it this way: climate positive, sustainability, placemaking, health and wellness, and the numinous or spiritual component.
And there are scales, right? He talked about scales to each of these, where they can look very different when you're talking about a town versus a city, right?
Exactly. So in a town, you might be talking about nature trails and being able to walk to a few shops to run errands. But in a city, you're dealing with infrastructure and an entirely different beast.
So we all need to advocate for more biophilic communities.
Yes, exactly. This is going to look different depending on where you are, but find out who your city officials are, your city council, or maybe the planning department. Make sure they are aware of the ideas and how impactful and positive they can be. Educate yourself and your community about the positive outcomes, the economic advantages, and start making that argument.
I mean, take a look at the Atlantic Beltline, for example.
Or the High Line in New York City.
Exactly. Or even Serenbe. These places are thriving because people want to be here.
Exactly. Once people start to see the benefits, the argument kind of make for themselves.
All right, guys. Well, that does it for our first episode. Congratulations, Jennifer.
Congratulations, Monica. We did it.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. And we hope you'll tune into episode 2 that's going to be with Bill Browning of Terrapin Bright Green.
If you want to support, please follow, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating if you don't mind. It really helps, and we really, really appreciate it.